Okay, hi everyone. I'm Radhika, and we'll start in a couple of minutes as soon as we've got a few things.
We're live on YouTube, Radhika.
Are we live on YouTube?
We're live.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Can I please request everybody who is not speaking to please mute themselves? Okay, I guess we should get going. Paul, we are live on YouTube. You are all recording. I should go to speaker view, which I have. Okay, great. So welcome everyone to this next International Manifesto Group webinar entitled The End of US Hegemonism in West Asia. My name is Radhika Desai and I convene the International Manifesto Group. In the wake of Palestinians observing the 75th Nakba Day, the day when Palestinians were pushed out of their homelands, this Zoom panel explores the rapidly changing contours of domestic and international politics in West Asia, a region which we also know as the Middle East. And this is also happening in the wake of the restoration of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia in a deal brokered by China. So all elements of this scenario indicate a very big change that is coming. And in our panel, our speakers will help us to collectively figure out how transformative this agreement and many of the other changes that it symbolizes has been for the Middle East or West Asia. Ever since the First World War made the strategic importance of oil clear, the Middle East has been one of the principal theaters of imperialist intervention by the West, led by the UK and France, and of course, soon joined by the United States. That imperialist intervention intensified massively in the 1980s with the proclamation of the so-called Carter Doctrine. Just months before proclaiming the Carter Doctrine, in which President Carter essentially said that the United States was going to feel free to use force to defend its national interests thousands of miles away in the Middle East, the president had delivered a rather sagacious speech calling on the US to focus on resolving its own ills, the inflation, stagnation, the crisis of political legitimacy with the Nixon and Watergate scandal, the defeat in Vietnam, and of course, the all-important energy crisis. And he urged the country to do so with its own resources and will, rather than relying on the rest of the world to solve its problems for them. He said inter alia that we are taught that our armies were always invincible and our causes were always just, only to suffer the agony of Vietnam. We respected the presidency as a place of honor until the shock of Watergate. We remember when the phrase "sound as a dollar" was an expression of absolute dependability until 10 years of inflation began to shrink our dollar and our savings. We believed that the nation's resources were limitless until 1973, when we had to face our growing dependence on foreign oil. These are Carter's words, and of course today if you had a leader who was willing to admit such things, the United States would be in a much better position, as would the world. However, that was not to be. It's very clear that imperialist lobbies got the better of him in short order, and just 6 months later, he announced the Carter Doctrine, in which the US has arrogated to itself the right to use force in the Middle East to protect its so-called national interest. Hence, West Asia, or the Middle East, has been at the center of the path of denial, vain aggression, and increasing desperation on which the United States set itself. And we are now seeing the inevitable unraveling of this strategy that the United States had and could have. Where until recently it was Israel that appeared to be winning friends across the region, as several Middle Eastern countries signed the so-called Abraham Accords. Today, we see a very different reality with the Chinese brokered agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to restore their relations, and that indicates a major reorientation of the Middle East. But of course, situation is always more complex, and the broad parameters that we can name within which today this reorientation of the region is taking place can be identified as the consisting of several factors. For example, the economic decline of the United States, thanks to its financialization, rising inequality, social division, political breakdown, racial divisions, etc. And divisions that are also manifest as Congress is about to start debating this dubious new debt ceiling agreement that President Biden and Kevin McCarthy have come up with. Secondly, there is increasing clarity around the world that the United States has, what it has to offer is war and self-destruction of those with the misfortune and lunacy to become US allies. Thirdly, there is the rise of China, and with the party state's commitment to the betterment of its people. Fourthly, also the spreading recognition that what China has to offer its partners around the world is development and empowerment, the complete opposite of what we see the US offering. There is also the ongoing struggle of the peoples of the region for development, dignity, and above all, for peace. There is Israel's increasing repression of Palestine, even as, according to Ilan Pappé, two parts of the state, a conservative, hyper-religious wing willing to not just raise the specter of war, but to wage war, particularly against Iran, in order to keep its precarious control over the Israeli state apparatus, and an allegedly liberal wing concerned about losing control over the same state apparatus and also concerned about its international image. But the fact of the matter is both of these parties are in common agreement about the need to repress the Palestinian aspirations for independence. And finally, there are residual liberal and neoliberal forces across the region, including in countries like Iran, that are supported by the United States and encouraged to mount so-called color revolutions for regime change. So these are just some of the factors that I can think of. I'm sure that I've left many important ones out, but that's why we've got this esteemed panel to put before you their views. So we have about 6 speakers. And I will introduce them in turn as they come. They will each speak for about 10 minutes to make, give opening statements about 10 minutes, and then we will have questions and answers. I should add that we are all here on Zoom, and we are also broadcasting live streaming on the International Manifesto Group website, and we will soon share the YouTube link for that. So please feel free to share on Twitter and so on to encourage people to watch it. Throughout this event, the chat function will remain open, but please, we request those who are using it to remain respectful and civil. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mazda Majidi, and Mazda is a longtime social justice and anti-war activist with the Answer Coalition, who has written extensively on US intervention in the Middle East. So Mazda, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your great introduction. And thanks to you and everyone who has had a role in putting this discussion together. These discussions can be very useful. So I thought I'd start out by attempting to put this discussion in its historical context, which already Radhika did, by the way, but maybe I'll add to that a little bit. So why is it that the US seems to be losing its hegemony? Why are we even having this discussion? What has changed? If 20 years ago, if someone told me that the US would lose its hegemony in the region in 2 decades, I would have assumed that the people of the region were going to have successful revolutions. But unfortunately, the states in the region haven't gone progressive. Countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, Jordan, and others have not had revolutions. The region is still dominated by right-wing reactionary governments, many of them under the leadership or influence of Saudi Arabia, and their relationship to Israel that Radhika pointed to is another point that basically shows the nature, the character of these states. And it's not that the leaders of these states have now somehow changed their minds or decided to try a different approach. Only objective reality can cause this kind of change. So again, what has changed? I think what has changed is that the US has lost its aura of invincibility. The US no longer looks like an absolute power that can impose its will on all developments in the region. We have to go back to the 90s when, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the US was happy to be at the head of a unipolar world. The US was going to establish its hegemony across the globe. It was going to redraw the map of the Middle East to suit its interests. The US was going to overthrow every progressive state, every nationalist, every independent, or even semi-independent state, even ones that entered deals with the US on occasion. To recall where things were just 20 years ago, we have to remember the words of John Bolton after the US invasion of Iraq. He said, quote, "Iran and Syria should heed the lessons of Iraq," end quote. That lesson was supposed to be that anybody who does not toe Washington's line is doomed to be invaded, occupied, destroyed. So the occupation of Iraq did not go as planned. The US did not manage to install another client state in the region. Iraq did not turn into another Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. There was so much Iraqi resistance to the occupation that by the mid-2000s, the US had to give up on its dream of installing a client state. Instead, it modified its plans just to avoid the appearance of outright defeat. 20 years later, Iraq is not at all what the US had envisioned when it invaded and occupied Iraq. Of course, the people of Iraq have suffered tremendously, but the Iraqi state is not the stable, and it certainly is not an obedient client state. Afghanistan is another example of a US failure. It wasn't clear for a while, and the US did not suffer a catastrophic defeat on the battlefield. Still, what did the US do after 20 years? It ended up leaving Afghanistan and leaving the Taliban in power, the very same force that was in power before the US occupation. And it wasn't a graceful US exit either. The US exit from Afghanistan did not exactly portray the image of an all-powerful superpower. In Libya, which is, of course, North Africa, and in many ways, West Asia, Middle East, and North Africa are one regional political unit. But in Libya, the US and its NATO allies overthrew the nationalist state led by Muammar Gaddafi. But even this military intervention did not lead to a complete US victory, in that Libya today is anything but a stable client state. In Syria, short of an outright invasion, the US, its junior imperialist partners, and reactionary Arab states did everything they could to overthrow the Syrian state. Not just the US, but Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar spent millions upon millions of dollars to overthrow the Ba'ath Party government of Syria led by Bashar Assad. But it didn't work out for them. Iran and Russia intervened. Lebanon's Hezbollah intervened. And with their help, the Syrian Arab army and militias loyal to Assad held on. The forces that were called pro-democracy in the West, which were really different flavors of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, were largely defeated. Syria survived. And now Saudi Arabia and others are forced to acknowledge reality and reestablish relationships with Damascus. Even the timing of Saudi Arabia welcoming China into the region diplomatically speaks to the forced acceptance of the new realities. It came right after new hopes of the US, Saudi Arabia, Western European imperialists, and others, their hopes of a regime change in Iran faded. Saudi Arabia has now welcomed China's diplomacy, as Radhika said in her remarks. They've welcomed China's diplomacy into the region, and the US is not happy about that. Today, even heads of client states in the region no longer think that the strength of the US military alone can shape the political scene and bend the realities to its will. Ever since the period after World War II, many oppressed countries or third world countries in the US camp have been referred to as client states, puppets, comprador, etc. The reason for this, and not necessarily as allies because they weren't on an equal footing with the US. The reason for this is that such states, by and large, did not represent their own country's aspirations for independence. Instead, they took their commands from Washington. They knew that if they crossed Washington, they were likely to be replaced in a coup or allowed to succumb to popular opposition within their country. Still, the puppet analogy, as useful as it might have been, hides one basic fact. A puppet or a client is only loyal to their imperialist master for self-interest or self-preservation. It's just that their self-interest and the interests of their imperialist masters often aligned. However, if those interests do not align, the client will not always remain loyal to the US. If a client thinks that the US side in a conflict may or may not win, that what the US is pushing for may or may not happen, why would they unconditionally obey and follow? Mohammed bin Salman is one of the most reactionary elements on the planet. He's even ruthless towards other members of the Saudi royal family. Western analysts sometimes talk about how bin Salman is now a little older and a little wiser, and that he has become more of a realist. That may well be true, but he is expanding his relationship with China because he is recognizing the reality that China is a major power and that it no longer makes sense for Saudi Arabia to be hostile to China just to please the US. So in a sense, we are looking at a new era in West Asia and North Africa. We have already seen this happen in other parts of the world, most notably in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. US policymakers are extremely worried about China extending its reach internationally, and they should be. However, for the people of the region, the erosion of US hegemony and expanding relationships with China is a positive development. It's not something to worry about. There is so much propaganda against China in the West that this turn of events is presented almost as an existential threat to humanity. But unlike the United States, China has not invaded dozens of countries. China does not have close to 1,000 bases in 80 countries around the world. China does not threaten countries with invasions, occupations, and coups d'etats. China does not openly intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. China does not state that it is time for Saddam to go, Assad to go, Gaddafi to go, and follow through with military action. China does not force aggressive economic restructuring plans on countries, forcing them to rapidly privatize industries and services. And while the US will give third world countries mostly assembly plants and service sector investments, think McDonald's and Starbucks, China helps build infrastructure such as power plants, dams, highways, bridges. There has been a lot of propaganda about China supposedly fleecing these countries. But in fact, the prices China has offered for projects have been much better than what the Western countries have offered. Their interest rates have been lower, and in many cases, they have even forgiven the debts. So the loss of US dominance in the region does not necessarily mean that the likes of Saudi Arabia are pivoting towards China strategically. Many of these countries may just want to add to their options. They may just want to use China for leverage in negotiating with the US, both on the economic and political level. Still, the loss of a decades-long US hegemony can only be a positive development for the region that can potentially open lots of other possibilities. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mazda. Very well timed. Our next speaker is Ali Abunimah. Ali Abunimah is author of One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse. He was a co-founder of the online publication, the Electronic Intifada, and a policy advisor with Al-Shabaka. Ali, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Radhika. My thanks to the International Manifesto Group for inviting me to this important discussion alongside such distinguished analysts. Some of my analysis will overlap very strongly with what we just heard from Mazda, but I hope to also elaborate on some different points as well. After returning to power at the head of an ultra-far-right coalition in December, Benjamin Netanyahu hoped quickly to resume Tel Aviv's march towards full normalization with Arab regimes. The Israeli leader was still flying high from the so-called Abraham Accords, brokered under the Trump administration between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and other countries as well, such as Oman, were rumored to be getting involved. But the major unfinished business was a deal with Saudi Arabia. Although Riyadh has made some very major moves to cozy up to Tel Aviv, the kingdom remains officially outside the Abraham Accords. Netanyahu claimed after returning to power that establishing formal ties with the Saudis would, quote, be a quantum leap that would effectively end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I presume by isolating and weakening the Palestinians. It would also solidify the American-led axis against Iran, long the arch-enemy of the regimes in Tel Aviv and Riyadh. The Biden administration in recent months intensified its efforts to broker such a deal, but without success. The exorbitant demands put forward by the Saudis, including US security guarantees, more arms sales, and assistance with the civilian nuclear program, appeared designed to be rejected and thus to provide Riyadh with a way out of formally embracing Israel. For the foreseeable future, therefore, the Saudis have had a change of heart about turning their long engagement with Israel into a marriage. Meanwhile, in March, there was a diplomatic earthquake. Rather than sign up formally to Israel's obsessive crusade against Iran, the Saudis decided instead to make their peace with Tehran. Even worse, from the Israeli and more importantly, the American perspective, the historic rapprochement was brokered by China, whose growing power and confidence is setting alarm bells ringing among the imperial managers in Washington. China had never before brokered such a major breakthrough in the region, and it is now offering even to facilitate peace talks between the Israelis and Palestinians. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett described the Iran-Saudi rapprochement as, quote, a grave and dangerous development for Israel and a significant diplomatic victory for Iran, end quote. It is indeed not only a major setback for Israel and a victory for Iran, but a victory for the people of the whole region, whose lives have been overturned for decades by US-fueled wars, sanctions, and chaos. The Saudi move towards independent action and its implications for the United States and Israel, as well as for the Palestinians, can really only be understood in the context of the current shift towards a multipolar world, specifically the rise of China, its deepening partnership with Russia, and the simultaneous erosion of American power. The latter seems to be accelerating due to Washington's ill-advised proxy war against Russia, which Ukraine has no chance of winning. The hubris with which American and European elites embraced that war, which they had been stoking for years since the coup instigated by the United States in Ukraine in 2014. The hubris has been dashed against the rocks of reality, even if they cannot yet admit it. For all its massive military spending, it is apparent that the US and the Europeans do not have the industrial and military resources to sustain Ukraine against Russia in a grueling, old-fashioned land war. The EU and US shock and awe sanctions that in President Joe Biden's words would turn the ruble into rubble and sink the Russian economy have not only failed, but are backfiring on their authors. Countries around the world are accelerating de-dollarization, trading in their own currencies in order to shield themselves from Washington's much-used sanctions weapon. All of this is a far cry from where the United States stood at the end of the Cold War, an unrivaled military, diplomatic, and economic colossus. No other country could have assembled a 500,000-strong army and deployed it halfway around the world as the United States did in 1990 and 91 to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. That New World Order of American dominance and endless expansion was supposed to last forever, but it hasn't worked out that way. The criminal US invasion of Iraq in 2003 led to no lasting US influence and only ended up strengthening Iran. And it is now Chinese companies, not US corporations, which are rebuilding Iraq. Meanwhile, the Obama administration's regime change war in Libya overthrew Muammar al-Gaddafi and left that country a lawless failed state and a hub for human trafficking. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of American imperial decline was the US defeat and humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021 after 20 years of occupation. Already, the Saudi-Iranian reconciliation has unlocked the path to ending the US-backed war in Yemen and the proxy war in Syria after more than a decade of devastation due to the US-led regime change effort against Damascus using Al-Qaeda-affiliated proxies. Given all this, one can hardly blame the Saudis for looking for a way out of their total dependence on Washington, a relationship that began in 1945. Normalization with Israel on Washington and Tel Aviv's terms only ever made sense in a context where the Saudis had to do whatever it took to please their American patrons. And if that meant embracing the Zionists, then so be it. In the emerging multipolar world, the Saudis have options and clearly intend to pursue them. From their perspective, Washington is 7,000 miles away from Riyadh. And the United States is an increasingly mercurial and unreliable partner or ally or master, whatever you might want to call it. You just have to look at the circus that is US national politics today. After the debacles in Ukraine and Afghanistan, not to mention Vietnam and so many other places since World War II, which regime would now bet on Washington coming to its rescue in its hour of need? The Saudi interest in so-called peace with Israel peaked when Riyadh felt most vulnerable and needed to shore up its relationship with the US. Now that the kingdom, like other countries, is pursuing a multipolar strategy, what is the rush to embrace Israel? Iran, meanwhile, will always be next door, and Saudi Arabia sits on the same Eurasian continent as Russia and China. Already, China is Saudi Arabia's top trading partner. The Saudis seem to be aware that not just their regime's security, but their prosperity and future can only be guaranteed by good relations with those whom they live near and with whom they trade. Other countries are undoubtedly coming to similar conclusions. Whatever we may feel about the nature of its regime, and indeed I agree with Mazda that it is one of the most reactionary regimes in the world, Saudi Arabia, with its vast oil wealth, will always have something to offer other countries and therefore options and leverage in a multipolar world. As for Israel, what can it offer the world? Its overhyped high-tech may be useful to some regimes, but they are hardly unique. Israel has a tiny, uncompetitive manufacturing industry and is not a major energy producer. It is moreover suffering a major brain drain as the best and the brightest pull out their second passports and jump ship. Israel, to be frank, is a toxic settler colonial project of the West that is only becoming more horrifying, burdensome, and extreme with each passing year. Israel has little prospect of finding another sponsor as devoted and generous as the United States, and that spells trouble for Tel Aviv. As US power continues to recede regionally and globally, so will Israel's. At the same time, as the US and Israel weaken, we have seen the axis of resistance grow in strength and confidence, and this is already having a major impact in Palestine. Israel recognizes the growing unity and capabilities of the resistance it faces on all sides, and it has no answer. Its defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said this publicly in April. Quote, "This is the end of the era of limited conflicts," Gallant said. "We are facing a new security era in which there may be a real threat to all arenas at the same time." For Tel Aviv, the biggest threat is Hezbollah, which humiliated the Israeli army when it invaded Lebanon in 2006. Hezbollah, like Palestinian armed resistance groups, is supported by an increasingly confident and technologically capable Iran. This means that even as Israel becomes more fanatical and extreme, its room to maneuver is diminishing. As the Palestinian people once again become the clear majority between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, Israel faces the same fate as apartheid South Africa. No doubt, Israel's military might means it can kill and destroy, but it can no longer dictate political terms to anyone, not to Iran, not to Lebanon, not to the Saudis, and not even to the Palestinian resistance groups in tiny, isolated Gaza, who showed once again earlier this month that they are willing to fight in defense of the Palestinian people everywhere, especially in Jerusalem. It is clear that the liberation of Palestine cannot take place under the shadow of Euro-American imperialism. The West will do all it can for as long as it can to shore up its apartheid settler colony. But as I've argued in this brief survey, the world is changing, power is shifting, and US imperialism is in retreat. Those facts alone do not guarantee any specific future or outcome, especially as Mazda correctly noted that the regimes in the region continue to be reactionary regimes. But these changes open up great possibilities for a more equal, just, and prosperous world based on partnership and cooperation if we seize them. Even in Palestine, I believe, we can already see on the horizon the first glimmers of the dawn of liberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. That was really inspiring, and I think you aroused a lot of political hope, so that's lovely. Our next speaker is Loki. Loki is a British Iraqi hip-hop artist, academic, political campaigner, and Mint Press video and podcast host. As a musician, Loki has collaborated with the Arctic Monkeys, Wretch 32, Immortal Technique, and Akala. He's a patron of the Stop the War Coalition, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the Racial Justice Network, and the Peace and Justice Project founded by Jeremy Corbyn. So, Loki, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it was wonderful to hear what Ali had to say. To start with, I think it's important to understand that the United States policies are now coming under greater scrutiny in the region, and people are able to look at, for example, the adventure in Afghanistan of NATO and the US, which produced 5.3 million refugees. That was a quarter of the Afghan population. It left 72% of Afghans in poverty and rendered statistically Afghans the saddest people in the world. Now, following their exit from Afghanistan in an act of imperial spite, the US government decided to freeze $9.5 billion worth of assets in the Afghan central bank. And it is predicted that off the back of that, the poverty rate in that country will reach 97%. It's also estimated that 95% of the population simply don't have enough to eat. And many have said that the economic war that the United States is waging on Afghanistan is likely to kill more than the military war actually did that preceded it. We know that before the US invasion of Afghanistan, opium production in the country was almost zero. Well, after the occupation, it led to a situation where 90% of the world's heroin originated in Afghanistan, and Helmand was the center of that production, which housed 10,000 British Army soldiers on 140 bases there at the height of the occupation. What else did the US bring to Afghanistan? Well, of course, we know that the organization DynCorp, which was owned by Veritas, which featured on it the Secretary of State under Bush, Richard Armitage. This company was revealed by WikiLeaks to have actually hired children as sex slaves in Afghanistan. This is something Afghans were aware of, but many in the English speaking media did not make a big deal out of this. This was seen as perfectly fine, it seems. Armor Group, another organization that the US employed to guard the US embassy in Afghanistan. Its employees were found to be violating the Trafficking Victims Protection Act by having its employees visiting brothels in Afghanistan. This is what the United States has carried a reputation for in that country, though it seems to be unbeknownst to many people in the US. Well, what has China brought in comparison to the United States to Afghanistan? Well, what we have seen is at the same time as the US is pursuing economic war against Afghanistan, you have actually had massive investment by China began over 3 years. Afghanistan is due to get over 500 million pounds worth of investment from China in the oil sector, $500 million, sorry. But then also the lithium question has come up, with China offering to invest $10 billion into Afghanistan at the very time when the US is taking around $10 billion from Afghanistan. And what about Iraq? Well, what did the US bring to it? Well, it's the invasion of Iraq was something that 36 million people across 3,000 demonstrations globally actually protested against. A deeply, deeply unpopular thing to do. And in the very first month of the US occupation of Iraq, over 29,000 bombs were used by the US on Iraqis. It was an occupation that displaced 1 in 25 Iraqis and killed over 1 million people. And how has the United States now marked culturally its escapade in the cradle of civilization? Well, now you have computer games in the US like 6 Days in Fallujah, which essentially places the game player in the position of the soldier within Fallujah at the time when the US was bombing it with white phosphorus and depleted uranium. The US have even gone as far as naming a warship after the campaign in Fallujah. And Noam Chomsky has actually made the point that the toxic legacy and cancer rates in Fallujah are worse than Hiroshima. You've seen a 17-fold increase in leukemia in Fallujah and a 38-fold increase in other cancers. And since that period of time when the US occupied Afghanistan and Iraq, it spent $32 million per hour on war. We are talking about a campaign that lasted 2 decades and entailed the US dropping on average 46 bombs per day for 20 years and displacing around 37 million people. Well, if we contrast what the US brought to Iraq with what China is bringing to Iraq, well, throughout the US occupation of Iraq, you saw only 17 new school construction projects started. We don't have any information whether the US finished those constructions of schools, but we know the US supposedly started the construction of 17 new schools in Iraq. Well, China has just signed contracts with Iraq to build 1,000 schools in the short term and actually 8,000 schools in the long term across the next decade or so in Iraq will be built by China. If you are in the Iraqi position, surely you would look at that. You'd understand, for instance, Halliburton, given one of the largest no-bid contracts in the history of the United States, just before the invasion. And then you see the type of contracts that have been arranged between the Iraqis and China when it comes to oil, and they clearly see a fairer deal being given to them by the Chinese. And what about Iran? Well, we've seen the United States pursue relentless economic warfare against Iran, leading to a situation where just before the sanctions started, the Iranian economy grew by 12.5% in 1 year. The year the sanctions were put in place, or intensified significantly under Trump, it shrunk the Iranian economy by 6% in 6 months alone. You in fact saw Iran's ability to export oil. You saw its oil exports decrease by 80%. And of course, that is a massive factor in Iran's national income. You saw, for instance, Italy and Greece, because of these US sanctions, halting their imports of Iranian oil. You saw Indian imports of Iranian oil fall also. And at that time, Chinese imports of Iranian oil fall. But what has taken place with the turn around 2021 and then 2022 with the war in Ukraine? You've seen an increase, a massive increase in the oil deals between Iran and China, particularly. And as a result of these sanctions, in literally the first 12 months of the intensification under Trump, you saw the cost of red meat and poultry increased by 57%. You saw milk, cheese, and eggs increase by 40%. And the cost of vegetables in Iran increased by 47%. Unemployment rose by 15% in the first year alone. And what we also know is that Iran has one of the fastest growth rates of cancer in the world. There are around 112,000 new cases of cancer every year in Iran. And the International Journal of Health Policy and Management made the point that the sanctions were directly affecting Iran's ability to treat people with cancers. This is what the United States has done to this country, attempt to bring it to its knees through economic warfare. Now, how is China differing to that? So, of course, as part of the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and Iran, began in 2021, but has got better over time, they've agreed to invest around $400 billion into Iran over 25 years. And what has that led to? It has led to China assisting Iran in undoing some of the work the United States has done to isolate it in the region. So it has brought together Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has ended the immense human suffering in Yemen, which actually was the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time, for sure, with tens of thousands of children starving to death thanks to the Saudi blockades. But let's be clear, the US and Britain were constantly benefiting from this war, whether it was through weapons sales, whether it was through directly helping with targeting. In many ways, it was a US and British proxy war against Iran being fought in Yemen. And so China has, in one fell swoop, been able to mend those fences and ameliorate huge amount of human suffering that was the case in Yemen. So clearly this would upset the United States, which gained huge profits through the arms contracts with Saudi Arabia, and also the promotion of the Iranian bogeyman to people in the Gulf. It allowed the US to spread its military bases further and further, and also, as I mentioned, sell weapons. But then what did that bringing of Iran out of the cold lead to vis-a-vis the Palestinian resistance? Well, what you saw was Saudi Arabia welcoming Hamas to the country. Let's be clear, the only state in the world which supports the Palestinian right to armed resistance materially is Iran. So therefore, when Iran is put into a less isolated position, it leads to the Palestinian resistance factions being in a less isolated position than ever. And so Saudi Arabia has now even made overtures towards Hezbollah, who, through its proxies in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia has been essentially at a state of war with for decades in Lebanon. So these are all interesting developments. So Chinese policy in West Asia is directly having an effect on the equation within Palestine and the ability of Palestinians to defend themselves from Israel's violence. And what we look at with the US relationship with Israel, as Ali has clearly put out, it's not a question of Israel merely being backed by the United States. The US and Israel are deeply intertwined, and the US will do everything it can to protect its settler colony. Now, the US relationship, it entails $10.4 million a day, $430,000 an hour, $7,229 a minute, and $120 a second of US taxpayers' money being bestowed upon racist Israeli apartheid in Palestine. But an interesting factor and contradiction which is developing more and more in the US-Israel relationship is, of course, Israel has a long and strong history of spying on the US government. You've seen the cases of Stephen Pollard, Jonathan Pollard actually ending up in prison in the US for spying on them and stealing nuclear secrets. You've of course seen examples where Israel has been found to be hacking the White House phone line. It's believed that Israel obtained foreknowledge of the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal, and later it has been reported Israel attempted to use it to blackmail Clinton to obtain the release of Pollard. So there is
I hate to say this, Loki, but could you wrap up? It's very interesting, but yeah.
No problem at all. So essentially, we are now at the point where in the recent protest movement that developed in the political entity of Israel, what you saw is one of the key groups that was active in this, the movement for quality government in Israel, was actually funded directly by the US State Department. And so then this led to even the fascist Ben-Gvir in the Israeli government saying the US needs to understand that Israel is an independent country and no longer a star on the US flag. So these contradictions are sharpening even with well-established allies in the region, and this will lead to ultimately a more just and equal world.
Thank you so much, Loki. That was just so detailed and absolutely fascinating. I think sometimes we think in general terms and forget the really hard-hitting facts that I think, Loki, you did such a great job of presenting. Okay, so let me introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Yao, I hope I say this right, but Yao Jinxiang. He's currently Assistant Research Fellow at the China Institute for International Studies, the CIIS. He has received 2 PhD degrees in 2019 in international politics, one at the School of International Studies at Peking University, and the other in the Graduate School of Asia-Pacific Studies at Waseda University in Japan. He has received his MA in International Politics from the School of International Studies, Peking University, and his BA from the Renmin University of China. So Jinxiang, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I'm Yao from, could you hear my voice? Okay, I'm Yao from China Institute of International Studies, CIIS, and it is affiliated to Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm honored to participate in this conference as only Chinese and show my thoughts on the current West Asia and Chinese diplomacy, as we know that many people and many global think tanks talk about China, Chinese politics, economy, or diplomacy.
What happened there?
Good opportunity to exchange our views with you. And first of all, I am glad to say that is a Middle East efforts in Saudi and Iran. But I think the most important reason is a change of perceptions and policies of Middle East countries themselves. They are beginning to be more autonomous, and they are trying to decide their foreign policies according to their own interests, rather than serving the geopolitical needs of certain global powers. So I think this is, and I think it is not only the case in the Middle East, but also in other regions, especially in what we call the global South. And I think this kind of dynamic has become increasingly evident recently. And in recent times, the Western countries, such as the G7 summit and the EU Parliament, they has stopped using the term decoupling with China and started to use the term de-risking when talking about China. By the same logic, I think many countries around the world are also promoting de-risking in their relations with the United States. And I think the United States has overused its hegemonic power, especially the US dollar, and has frequently used sanctions to rethink their relations with US. And many countries feel that they might be the next target of US sanction. And I think this is one of the major reasons of the change in their relations with the United States. And next, as a Chinese scholar, Middle East diplomacy, especially China's role in pushing for the normalization of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And first, I think it is in line with China's new diplomatic principles or approaches in recent years. And I would like to introduce 3 keywords in China's diplomacy. The first is the community of shared future for mankind. And it is China's philosophy thinking about the future of the world. And it emphasizes that we need to join together to address the global challenges, no matter where you come from, no matter what your religion, race, or nationality is, we shall join together to tackle the problems together. And the second keyword is the new type of international relations. And this kind of word emphasize that we need to step out of the logic of geopolitical competition and try to define the future of international relations by peace and win-win cooperation. And the third keyword is the three new concepts China proposed since last year. That is the Global Security Initiative, GSI, Global Development Initiative, GDI, and the Global Civilization Initiative, GCI. The three concepts are very important in China's diplomacy right now. And China has also repeatedly stressed that promoting the normalization of Iran and Saudi diplomatic relations is also a practice of the Global Security Initiative, GSI. And we have also put forward a roadmap of these three initiatives right now, and we hope to make these initiatives more effective. And my second thought about China's Middle East diplomacy is that right now there is a big change about how China looks at the Middle East. In the past, China also wanted to increase cooperation with Middle East, but China was indeed very cautious and did not want to get involved in the complex regional conflicts in this region. But over the recent years, in our exchanges with our Middle Eastern friends, they have repeatedly stressed that they want China to play a more active role in this region, especially in the security sphere, social sphere, and the grassroots sphere. And I think China is changing step by step. Since 2019, our institute, CIS, has organized two Middle East security forums in Beijing under the guidance of the Chinese MOFA. And we're inviting diplomats and scholars from Middle East to participate in this forum. And it is a pioneering move to make China's voice can be heard in the field of security in Middle East. After that, we saw that the former China Foreign Minister Wang Yi also frequently visited Middle East and proposed the idea of the Gulf Dialogue platform. And it is actually a China's version of the Middle East security architecture. And we have discussed this kind of platform with our Middle East colleagues for many times, and they all have great interest in this kind of platform. And I think China does want to do more to promote security dialogue or security architecture in the Middle East. And my third thought is that I would like to talk about how we say the possible competition between China and the United States in the Middle East. Of course, China has realized the competition between China and the United States is inevitable, but China still wants the competition to be manageable. For example, in Asia Pacific or the so-called Indo-Pacific, China and the US will certainly have fierce competition. But in the Middle East, I hope that our focus should be on cooperation and try to make the Middle East the region where China and the US can have dialogue and communicate. For example, on issues such as counterterrorism or energy transition, China and the US can cooperate in this region. And I think the possibility to achieving peace in Middle East still have large possibility. On the one hand, I think China is not another USA or the former Soviet Union, and we have no intention to engage in a Cold War style competition with the United States in the Middle East. And on the other hand, I think the US is relatively weakened and could not support a full-scale strategic competition on a global scale. US may criticize some of its Middle East allies, such as Saudi or UAE, but there are still big limits when talking about actual policies or actual fiscal resources it can use. And my fourth thought is I think the recent changes in Middle East also reflects an ongoing change of China's overall diplomacy. And China hopes to play a more active role as a responsible global power. In our recent exchange with some regional countries, they also mentioned about this issue for many times. I try to understand this kind of change in two ways. On the one hand, China will be more active to defend its own interests. It stems from the fact that many Western countries have recently intensified their pressure on China, trying to block China in areas such as semiconductors, science, and high technology. So China must respond more actively. Otherwise, it will be difficult to safeguard our national interests. And on the other hand, I think China will be more active in protecting the interests of developing countries or the global south as a whole, and try to promote a balanced and fair international order. And I think only when the interests of the developing countries are protected, can only China's interests can be protected. And finally, I believe that the normalization of diplomatic relations between Saudi and Iran is indeed the greatest contribution that China has made to international peace since the six-party talks around the North Korea nuclear issue at the beginning of the 21st century. According to my understanding, right now, China's diplomats and China scholars have also gradually encouraged by this kind of move and want to make more contributions in the field of international peace talks. Right now, China's special envoys for Russia and Ukraine and the special envoys for the Middle East, Africa, and Afghanistan, they are all actively engaged in promoting the resolution of more international conflicts. I think right now, the philosophy and the goals of Chinese diplomats and scholars are changing, and they are also trying to promote the international peace, and promoting international peace has become an important pursuit for Chinese diplomats and scholars. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really great. And we will go to our two final speakers. Our next speaker is Professor Tim Anderson. Tim Anderson is a professor at Australia, and he's very well known for his anti-imperialist works. His most recent books are Land and Livelihoods in Papua New Guinea, The Dirty War on Syria, which has been translated into 10 languages, and Axis of Resistance Towards an Independent Middle East. As I said, Professor Anderson is known very widely for his anti-imperialist work, and in 2017, he was awarded the Cuban Friendship Medal, granted by the Cuban Council of State on the proposal of the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples. Tim is in a rather impossible time zone for us, so he has sent a video which I am going to share. So give me 1 second, please. I'm going to share that, and let's see. I think this should work, but please say if you can't hear him or see him.
Greetings, colleagues. On the end of US attempts at hegemony over West Asia, I'd like to say a few words in basically three themes. The first is the singularity of the wars in West Asia. The second is the essential ingredient of resistance. And the third is the need for a regional alliance. As I tried to argue in my book, Axis of Resistance, there is only a single war going on in West Asia, centered around Palestine and control of the entire region. It's important to look at the links between all these wars as they cut through the various false pretexts for the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, for the proxy wars against Libya and Syria and Yemen, for example. Those links help explain the persistence of the US with its losing wars and the key tactic of divide and rule, which persists to this day, the attempts to keep the various sections of the axis of resistance apart and to divide the resistance in every way possible. It also points to the need for unifying that resistance, and resistance is the key to getting rid of the US presence in this region. Locally, regionally, and in terms of solidarity, resistance is at the root of what is going to break the Israeli colony. Without resistance, there would be no Palestine. When we look at the region more broadly, particularly in Western cultures, we have to face this aspect of Orientalism, that the world is flooded with support for Palestine, supposed support for Palestine, but it's the non-violent, helpless victims that they want to support. As soon as Palestinians lift a hand in to resist the colonization, the brutalization, the land theft, the apartheid, they are condemned as being terrorists or whatever other name there. And so the opposition to the Palestinian resistance, the opposition to the regional resistance, that is to say, the states and peoples that support the Palestinian resistance, is a very common thing in the West, and there's a great deal of education that needs to be done about the right to resist. It's often not very well understood around the world. The third thing is the question of a regional alliance. In my view, it's absolutely critical, and if we take the lesson from Latin America, we've got 2 centuries of this demand that there is in their case, a continental union to oppose the imperial powers, because it's not possible, they said, for a very long time to stand up against the big powers as little people, as divided little people. Divided, there will be no expulsion of these big powers. And so the chief tactic is divide and rule within Palestine, within Syria, within Iraq. The attempts, when they can't overthrow a state like in Iran, they will surround it with proxies and separatists and various types of forces to try and weaken and divide those countries. They will try everything they can to divide the resistance in Lebanon from Syria, and Syria from Iraq, and Syria from Iran, for example. So in response to that, I say there's a great need for the unity of factions and also unity and solidarity, that is to stress the unified resistance in the region and support for the consolidation of a regional alliance, both in terms of states and in cultural and social terms too, that is to say, unity between various groups that are working together to support the resistance in West Asia. This is, of course, only the policy of only 2 states in the world, so far as I know, that Iran and Syria, for example, support all the resistance factions in Palestine. Most other states say, well, we'll support the Palestinian Authority because they seem to be the representative body. No, I suggest that supporting all the factions of the Palestinian resistance is a far better approach. And that means a strategic regional alliance based on common principles, based on a strategy for pursuing the goals of the resistance is important. It doesn't mean adopting models. It doesn't mean to say that those supporting the resistance have to support the guardianship principle or oppose the guardianship principle in Iran. There are different states. There's pluralist Syria. There's a long-term alliance that doesn't require the submission to a particular model, but it does require a strategic alliance with shared principles, shared values, and shared key objectives. And I say that's the only way to prevent imperial incursions, even if the big powers are defeated in this current round of wars, the new Middle East wars, as it was called by Condoleezza Rice some 16, 17 years ago. It's a necessary combination, the unity of the factions. So let's recognize that there is a single war in the region, that resistance is the key to defeating it, and a regional alliance of states and peoples, but also of social and cultural groups is very important. That's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We do have one for the speaker, Professor Mohammad Marandi, but he tells me on WhatsApp that he's stuck in the legendary traffic of Tehran, so he may join us soon. But well, let's hope he manages to join us soon. But in the meantime, I think we should go to the question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise them. There are speakers. We have for any speaker, please feel to use the raise hand function, which you will find under the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. Also, Professor Marandi says he can speak, but has he joined?
Yes.
Oh, he has. Excellent. Oh, brilliant. Okay, then Professor Marandi. Oh, brilliant. Let me quickly introduce Professor Marandi. We will have his speech and then we will go to the questions and answers. So Professor Mohammad Marandi is a professor of North American Studies, and he teaches in the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, please go ahead. Your floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I am not in an ideal place to speak, but I'll try my best to make some sense of what's going on. I think the very fact that we are seeing these extraordinarily important changes in West Asia is due to the fact that the United States is on the decline. The resistance, as the previous speaker rightly pointed out, has had a very important role in pushing back the United States, NATO, and their imperial ambitions. And this resistance is comprised of different groups, different countries, different organizations that work together to overcome this very difficult era in West Asian history. The very fact that, for example, Saudi Arabia is now tilting away from the United States in relative terms is because the United States is on the decline. And that decline, I think, is largely because the United States has overextended itself, like empires do. And the Saudis have found a certain amount of space, so they've tried to improve their relations with Russia, China. They also wish to redefine their relations with Iran. And as a result, we now see rapprochement taking place between Saudi Arabia and Syria. And the hope is that this also extends to Yemen. So I think this is important because it gives us hope that the United States in future will be less capable of manipulating the region. The method through which the United States is able to control the region is a combination of power, which is decreasing, but also through dividing the region. The main focus of US policy in this region is to maintain Israeli and apartheid strength. And of course, as the United States declines, this becomes more difficult because dividing the region also becomes more difficult for the United States to maintain. It is difficult for Europe and the United States to keep nations divided when they do not have the authority that they did in the past. So as the United States declines, the ability to divide and govern, the divide and conquer, divide and rule becomes less possible. And under these circumstances, we see also through the decline of the West, the shift in Turkey as well. Although it's too early to say, but the next president of Turkey, whoever he may be, will definitely recognize that NATO is in decline. Indeed, Turkey is facing major challenges because of its integration into Western economies, in the Western camp, and that the decline of the West poses new challenges for Turkey. So as Turkey has to readjust its policy, like Saudi Arabia, hopefully we will see a a reevaluation of their relationship with countries like Syria and Iraq, but Syria most importantly. And this future, the future of the West Asia, if these changes take place, if we do see this rapprochement that began with Iran and Saudi Arabia and is spreading across the region, if this continues, then I think we will see the collapse of Western hegemony in this region. Of course, this is not a foregone conclusion, and empires, as they decline, they become less predictable and often more dangerous. But I think the integration of the region, the fact that there is a possibility of convergence between Turkey, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Yemen, that we will be, if this continues, we will be faced with a new reality. Of course, I have to point out that this attempt for rapprochement began over 3 years ago, when General Soleimani, who led the coalition against ISIS, when he was traveling to Baghdad to meet the Iraqi Prime Minister, he was to meet the Iraqi Prime Minister at 8 a.m. roughly, and he arrived in Baghdad International Airport after 12 p.m. He was planning to see the Iraqi Prime Minister to discuss a Saudi letter. This is something that the former Iraqi Prime Minister said in Parliament. And the letter from the Saudis was about how to try to decrease tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And of course, General Soleimani was murdered by the Trump regime. So the initial attempts to bring about rapprochement were thwarted by the Americans. Not only did they want revenge on General Soleimani for defeating the extremist groups that NATO helped create, NATO and their allies, but the United States was fearful of a convergence of interests among countries in the region. Of course, later on, this attempt for rapprochement continued. The Iraqis they hosted numerous meetings between the Iranians and the Saudis. There was progress. They also spoke in Oman. And ultimately, after the Saudis asked the Chinese government to mediate, this rapprochement was brought about through the agreement that was struck in Beijing, which we all know about. So the decline of the West creates new opportunities for non-Western countries. Countries like China, when they do not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, they are seen as honest brokers, unlike the United States, which constantly takes sides and tries to manipulate. So as long as the United States continues down this road of manipulation, hegemony, domination, and war, it will continue to decline. And as long as the countries in the global South try to seek solutions where they are not seen to be mimicking US policies, then they will benefit and continue to rise. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That was really great and succinct. We should now go to the question and answer session. I hope very much Professor Marandi can stick around. I see one question. I see two questions. That's really great. I hope there will be more. And I'd just like to say that Professor Ali Abunimah has to leave, so I will give some priority to questions. He has to leave in about, 10 minutes or so. So I will give priority to questions aimed at him. I will take 3 questions to start with and then go to the next 3. So I have Paul Luckman, Chan Chi-Kun, and then Quanta Dawn in that order. Paul Luckman, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Paul Luckman. I'm a journalist and a geopolitical analyst. I live in Belgium, which is the heart of Europe. And that is exactly my question. Now, we are all in agreement that the power in the world shifts to China. So we see the US in decline. I'm just wondering what your panel thinks, what this means for Europe. Now, we have seen in Europe, well, Europe is really the peninsula of Greater Eurasia. So will there be a future for Europe in Greater Eurasia? What is your opinion?
That's great, Paul. Thank you very much. And I hope everybody will follow Paul's example and keep the questions succinct, precise, and to the point. Chang-Chi Kun, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. Yes, my name is Chang-Chi Kun. I'm a health and social policy analyst based in Malaysia. In the last couple of years, BDS Malaysia organized a couple of webinars, seminars again. In the one of them, online one of the panelists was Ilan Pape. And then another one about 6 months ago, Miko Pellet came to Malaysia for a speaking tour. So he also appeared at the University of Malaysia. At both sessions, I put a question to him, and that was considering the weakening position of the United States. That's Israel's a major patron in the region, and China's increasing presence. Whether those shifts of these major powers in that region might have some bearing on the situation of Israel-Palestine. Miko didn't explain, he just pointed to China's joint venture in managing the port of Haifa. Basically, I suppose to say that looks like they're not observing BDS. So those were their views, and this was before the Iran-Saudi rapprochement. So my question to the panel is, let me read it out. Where did I put it? Okay, here it is. Whether any of the panelists or participants in tonight's webinar could comment on these shifts in West Asia, how they might be perceived in Tel Aviv, and the spectrum of coping responses that might be anticipated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Quanta Dawnlight, please.
Thank you very much. My question is, I guess whoever wants to answer, I do think that it is very important at grassroots levels to have a global peace movement making its presence by protests, but continual protests throughout the large metropolitan areas in the world. How can we do this in China, in areas where the public protests are not allowed? Will China, for instance, allow the people, its people, to have a peace protest in Beijing, Shanghai, and in other places, as it would be allowed in the United States? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like Ali, perhaps if you would go first, since I know you have to leave, and then all the other panelists would, if you could please chime in to the points that you wish to address, that would be great. So Ali, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. May I just usurp your role slightly? I saw a chat from Arnold August that he also had a question for me, and I suspect this will be my only opportunity. Could we also take that question as well, and then I'll respond?
Please do.
All right.
Sorry, yes, you want Arnold to put his question.
Yes.
Arnold, please put your question, and then we will go to Ali.
Yeah, thanks for considering. Actually, it's to you, Ali, as well as to Marandi. As a member of the global gathering in support of the right of the Palestinians to choose resistance, I could not help but notice in yesterday's statement that was just released, there are 14 points. One of the points, I'll read, it's worthwhile, it's very, just 2-3 sentences. the conference stands in solidarity with Russia in its special operation in Ukraine and considers it a very important development that enhances the transformation of the resistance all over the world. So my question is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I previously has seen such a very clear statement by the global gathering with regards to supporting Russia. And if it is the first time, then how do you see, what is the cause of it? For example, we talk about the diminishing US hegemony in the region. Is this a direct consequence of the most recent, period of decline of US hegemony, which gives the confidence to the Palestinian people, a small country, right, to say what many larger countries, even in the global south, say, that we support the Russian opposition to NATO?
Thank you, Arnold. Ali, please go ahead.
Thank you. I do apologize that I have to go, as I have another commitment that I couldn't change, but I'll just give some responses to some of the points that were raised and use this opportunity to thank everybody for really a fantastic discussion and a great deal of insight. I learned a lot. I'll just try to answer some of the questions that struck me as best as I can. And one that really interests me was from our comrade in Belgium about what these developments mean for Europe. And I think Europe is really the most tragic case in a sense, because I think for many of us in the world, for many years, Europe looked like almost a model or an example of countries that had overcome their ancient hatreds and their history of war and genocide to build something hopeful for humanity. And it seems to have taken a very dramatically wrong turn at some point. We could have a long debate about when that turn happened. But we see now a Europe that has completely surrendered its sovereignty and independence and its future in order to follow the United States into an abyss. And I noticed the other day, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, saying that Europe, the EU, has to offer countries in the global south a more attractive alternative than China, so that the countries will be attracted to Europe rather than to China. And my response to that is, first of all, the EU has nothing to offer the world in comparison to China. The EU is not building infrastructure, schools, bridges, hospitals, airports around the world. They do some tiny projects which they make sure to do a big photo op around so everyone sees it. But the EU cannot bail itself out, let alone provide projects on a scale that the world needs in order to spread the kind of prosperity and development that billions of people deserve and have a right to expect. But my bigger question is, why does it have to be a competition? Why does Europe have to choose confrontation and competition with China? When my understanding, I try to look beyond the propaganda in our mainstream media to look at the facts. I've not seen China saying anywhere that they wish to have a competition with either the United States or the European Union or anyone else. On the contrary, the Chinese seem to be saying we are willing to work and cooperate with everyone, including Europe. As far as I understand it, Europe was also offered participation and partnership, for example, in the Belt and Road Initiative. But the Europeans are rejecting this solely due to their ideological commitment to US imperialism and hegemony and domination, and they have chosen to go down with the sinking ship. And this, to me, is a tragedy and a puzzle. So I hope that people in Europe can wake up and turn things around and choose a different future for their small peninsula. Ultimately, that's what it is at the western end of Asia. Regarding the question from our friend in Malaysia, I believe I addressed, I'm not sure if you were with us during my comments, but I feel like I did address the question of what these geopolitical changes mean specifically for Palestine and Israel. But one point I'll emphasize here is that, and you raised some points about China's policy. For example, China has competed for contracts. Chinese companies have competed for contracts in Israel. You mentioned the port of Haifa, and I can mention other infrastructure projects, for example, the Tel Aviv light rail, but also much more controversially, the Jerusalem light rail, which is a project in occupied territory. And I'll note that Palestinians were calling on the Chinese friends of the Palestinian people not to engage in projects in the occupied territory, which would contradict even the positions of China with regard to the occupied territory, positions that China has made clear on many occasions. In any case, that was quite a few years ago, so I'm not sure what the situation is now. But having said that, the bigger point I want to make is that China's policy with respect to Palestine is one of strict adherence to international law. Now, I would say, I could look at the Chinese policy and say, I would prefer that it be more radical on certain points, or on this point or that point. I could have disagreements with it, but I don't think that's the important thing. I think the important thing is that even strict adherence to international law is something that Israel and the United States cannot possibly tolerate. For them, they consider that to be a very dangerous development. Of course, it's one that I think is very important, adhering to international law. It's not necessary for countries, whether it's China or any other country, to take a completely partisan position on behalf of the Palestinians. Of course, I would prefer it, but that's not what is the case. What I'm saying is that for Israel, the loss of American power and influence is a much bigger danger than the details of what China's position may or may not be, because Israel, as an apartheid settler colony, cannot exist, cannot maintain its policies of apartheid, of oppression, of dispossession, of land theft, without unconditional support from the United States. China, India, Brazil, whoever it is, other powers in the world, will not give Israel this kind of unconditional support. And so that means that it is a net loss for Israel, and that creates new opportunities finally to reach a just situation in accordance with international law that restores full rights to the Palestinian people. So I'll just close, and then I will sign off by saying again, thank you to everyone. I'm so pleased to have this discussion. We live here in the West in particular, although right now I'm speaking to you from Jordan, but normally I'm based in the United States. We live in a fog of propaganda. We live in an empire of lies, where almost nothing we hear, whether it's about China, about Russia, about the rest of the world, that comes to us from mainstream media is true. We are taught to demonize. We are taught to hate. We are taught to fear. And this is something we have to break through and listen and understand and look at the facts and make up our own minds. And this session has been a great opportunity to do that. And I thank you, and I thank the IMG for continuing to allow us to do this work and to have these discussions. Thank you. And I will listen to the recording later because I don't want to miss a moment of this great discussion. But for now, I say goodbye to you and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ali, for that very insightful, I thought, answer, and also, of course, for the very important point about how necessary it is to break through the fog of propaganda. So, and thank you very much for their participation. Much appreciated. We'll now go, I think since Mohammad Marandi was another person to whom there was an explicit question addressed, maybe Professor Marandi, you would like to respond as well, and then I'll go to the other speakers, and then we'll have one more round of questions and answers and try to end at the 2-hour mark. So Professor Marandi.
Thank you very much. What exactly was the question?
Arnold, do you want to repeat your question? You're muted, Arnold.
Yeah, here it goes again. As a member of the global gathering in support of resistance, of the choice of resistance for the Palestinian people based in Beirut, I noticed yesterday in a statement that coming out of an important conference that just took place, for the first time, I believe they have a very open statement. I'll just read a few sentences. The conference stands in solidarity with Russia in its special operation in Ukraine and considers it very important development that enhances the transformation of the resistance into a global option, and goes on to explain why they support Russia, etc. So my question is this the first time such a statement has been released? And if so, is it partly as a result of the rapid demise of US in West Asia, or whatever the case may be?
Right. First of all, I'd like to apologize. As I said earlier, I'm sitting in a car, and I know you can't see my face well because the sun is behind me. So it depends on which way the car turns and the lighting at least. Iran's, I can't comment about any conference. I haven't seen any declaration for any conference in particular. But what I can say is that the Iranian position, and personally my own views on the conflict in Europe and in Ukraine, is that the main culprit is NATO. While Iran is neutral in the war, and Iran has not taken an official position, which I think, at least for the time being, is the right thing to do. The Iranians have said that NATO's expansion eastwards was a violation of their commitments to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The creation of military installations and installing nuclear missiles close to the Russian border are nothing but provocations, especially since the Russians, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, wanted to become a part of Europe. They wanted to become a part of the family of Europe, but they were, unlike Poland and other countries, they were rejected. And of course, after the coup in Ukraine, this is a story we all know. The United States, NATO, they supported right-wing and neo-Nazi or Nazi elements within the regime, which crushed the Russian-Ukrainian population and suppressed them. And there are different numbers, but somewhere between 14 to 16,000 Russian-speaking Ukrainians were killed in the east of the country by these groups such as the Azov Battalion, or now the Azov Brigade. So the Iranian position, till this moment at least, has been that Iran will maintain its neutrality, but it will not accept any sanctions against Russia. It will continue to work with Russia as it did in the past, whether it's military cooperation or civilian cooperation, trade, business, culture, education. All those fields of cooperation will continue to move forward as before. And that the West is in no position to dictate terms to Iran about who to sanction and who not to sanction, especially since Western countries have sanctioned all Iranians with maximum pressure. Sanctions that have to also add, or two things. One is that if we assume that the Russian attack, war on Ukraine, which is a valid argument, but even if we were to accept it, what is the difference between what, under those circumstances, of what Russia did and what the United States did in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, or the sanctions against Venezuela, or the war in Vietnam, and the list goes on. I think my good colleagues who are listening could name more than I can, or add their own countries to the list. What would be the difference between this war and those wars, even if we were to accept this argument? And that is, I think, one key reason why countries, and this is my final point, why many countries and many people in the global south automatically, it seems to me, do not sympathize with the West, because they feel that the West has been bullying the rest of the world for decades and centuries. And here I would add what Ali said earlier, and that is that the West not only is not building anything in the rest of the world, Western regimes, Western governments have plundered the rest of the world. Even as we speak now, countries are paying interest to loans that were taken out by pro-Western dictatorships 60, 70, 80 years ago. So the amount of money flowing into the West from the rest of the world still is much larger from what I read a few years ago than any so-called aid that is sent to other countries. The world does not need Western aid or assistance. The world needs the West to treat it with dignity and with respect, and not to consider itself to be superior and exceptional. So again, finally, I go back to the question. I don't know anything about the statement. I'll take a look at it, but my understanding is that the Iranian position hasn't changed, and my own views, I think, at least on this particular issue, are pretty close to the official Iranian position. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like Loki, Mazda, and Jinxiang, if you would like to address any of the questions posed in the first round, please go ahead.
Can I go?
Yes, please, Mazda.
Okay. All right. So I'd like to address, there was a question about the importance of protests and how are we going to deal with China not allowing protests. I thought this might be a good opportunity to talk about the role of protests and the role of imperialism, really. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure I would agree with the assumption that China would not allow demonstrations and protests. But in a way, this is not super relevant to the question. Speaking from the US, the belly of the beast, I mean, demonstrations and anti-war protests have played a historically significant role in the US. I mean, during the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement was so widespread that it had an impact on the military personnel in Vietnam. It reached a point that so many of the military personnel had been in one way or another, at one level or another, impacted by the anti-war movement that the US military could not trust many units to even fight. And there were many instances of fragging of individuals, enlisted people, killing their officers, especially officers that would give orders that were really gung-ho and would give what were perceived to be very dangerous orders. So the anti-war movement had an impact in significantly reducing the effectiveness of the US war machine. In the case of the US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the resistance to the occupations, the demonstrations, the marches were not quite at that level yet, but they were still very significant. It is something that various factions of the ruling class had to look at. The US ruling class, even though historically it is not particularly interested in the lives of anybody, as people have mentioned, the millions of people that the US has murdered in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, on and on and on. It's not like the same people who are driving these wars are worried about American lives, but in a way they are. And the reason they are is because they consider that a domestic cost. It makes it harder to wage war when there is a strong anti-war movement, that every time there's a news from the front of X number of people, X number of troops getting killed, that has impact on the US ruling class. So the reason I'm talking about that, demonstrations are important, protests are important. It is something that creates a collective for action in the streets. It helps form public opinion. It helps solidify forms of organization. All of those things are very important. But we have to mention, when it comes to the US in particular and its junior imperialist partners, it's quite a different thing. Whether or not people in Beijing march against US bombing of Afghanistan, for example, is not all that critical. I'm not discouraging that, of course, but it is where the people can have the most impact. So in a way, I don't think, as we're studying international affairs, I don't think we should view it as, one big world where we can demonstrate everywhere and it is effective. It is the US in particular and its allies that are responsible for the vast majority of crimes internationally. The numbers are in the millions. We have grown numb to the numbers. I mean, I think one of the people in the discussion talked about it, the millions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. We are growing used to it. I'm sorry that even I myself, and I know many of us, as much as we care about this issue and take action against US wars and occupations and bombings, and what's going on has been going on for 75 years since Al-Nakba, we also, to survive, we sometimes have to kind of stop ourselves from thinking about it. But that's where things are. And so while demonstrations and protests and marches internationally anywhere in the world are good for solidarity and other things, where it really, really matters, where it can have a critical effect, is in the heart of the imperialist world, where the states, the imperialist states, are waging these murderous wars in the name of the people, or democracy, or human rights.
Thanks very much, Mazda. I know that Jinxiang would like to say something, so please go ahead, Jinxiang.
Yes, thank you. I want to add some words on the China's protest, because I'm the only Chinese here, so I can express my ideas. So I think, of course, Chinese has legal rights for peaceful protest or demonstrations, and it is a legal rights clearly listed in China's constitution, and we can apply for this kind of protest or demonstration in our local police station. And in my memory, that I also take part in some kind of protest, such as when Japan illegally occupied China's Diaoyu Island, and we have this kind of protest, and when American bombed China's embassy in Yugoslavia, and we also have this kind of protest. So this kind of protest also existed in China. And I definitely know what you mean when you talk about the protest in China. But I think China has different systems with Western countries. So we have our own ways to tackle the problems and to solve the problems. Of course, protest has its role in China. And we also know how the zero coronavirus policy, how it is ended in China last year. And I think protest has its role in China. But in my opinion, the protest itself is so complex. in some protest in China, we can see some foreign agents or foreign money in it. So it's a complex things in China. So we can, and it's different to what you are used to in Western countries. So thank you.
Thank you. Those points about protests were particularly thought-provoking, I think. Sometimes I feel like saying that you need protests where there are actions that are so heinous and they need to be protested against. But, and Loki, I think I'd like to give you a chance if you would like to add anything, please. Perhaps Loki has left, not sure, I don't think he has. Okay. Okay, now we have 4 new questions. And in the interest of time, I won't give anybody a second chance to ask a question. So sorry about that. But I would like to wrap this up very soon. So may I request the 4 people, Oscar, Robert, Andreas, and Suzanne, to please keep your questions to 1 minute max. If you can keep them to the point, and then I will go through a round of responses from the speakers. So go ahead, Oscar. Oscar. Okay, Robert, why don't you go ahead? Robert Richard, please go ahead.
Good morning. Yes, I'm Robert Richard. I'm a Veterans for Peace. I demonstrated with Ambassador Kerry back in April '71. I'm a Vietnam era, Libya, Lebanon, Libya, Persian Gulf Navy war veteran. Since it's so evident all the violence now in East Jerusalem since the U.S. moved its embassy into Jerusalem because Mr. Adelson gave Mr. Trump $20 million. Do any of the, well, I was thinking maybe Ali might answer this, but he's gone, maybe Mr. Marandi. Would anyone in Iran or maybe even MBS give money to President Biden in order to get the U.S. embassy out of Jerusalem and back in Tel Aviv where it belongs? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Oscar, can you go ahead, please?
Yes, sorry. What we see in face of increased Chinese presence in South America is an increased military U.S. presence. General Richardson has stated several times that Latin America belongs to the U.S. interest, and that natural resources in Latin America are and the result of that militarization of foreign policy is a military presence in Peru right now, a U.S. military presence, and the continued visits to Colombia. And now there's a threat of a U.S. military presence in the north of Mexico. So that's the way the U.S. is handling Chinese presence in Latin America.
Thank you very much for that. Andreas Kramer and then Suzanne.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to ask about Israel and its interest. And one of the speakers, I don't remember who, sorry, said that we need not simplistically think of Israel as simply an extension of the United States, but that Israel has its own interest, and that even kind of sort of this ultra-fascist right says it wants some sort of independence from the United States. But this is, of course, at every level, completely, utterly impossible, economically, geopolitically, ideologically, and so forth. So I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on this. Where do Israel's interests diverge from the US at all? And what are Israel's own interests in this regard? And how can we think of it as different from the US colonial project? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andreas. Important question. And Suzanne, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to contribute to the discussion on the idea of demonstrations. I just want to say what I know is that in the United States and in Canada, from which I live, we have, I want to say what Ali Abunimah was saying, in essence, that we live in a society that lacks information, and the information is distorted, or it is or the information is not only distorted but false. It creates a disorientation in the society as a whole, and that has been reflected on the left, among socialists, for instance. A lot of people have conspiracy theories, for instance. That's why I don't want to say what's happening in China. I belong to the IMG, the International Manifesto group, because it represents a door to China where I can actually learn about China. And that's very important. I can't form an opinion unless I have some information. And that's the only place where I can get information, actually. I urge you to join the IMG. So that's the only thing I wanted to tell you, because it reflects the fact that we are lacking information, the fact that we have distorted information, and that the fact that the information is false means that we don't have good responses, major responses to the wars that are going on, carried out by our governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that ringing endorsement of the IMG. And I'd just like to say, before we go to the final round of responses, that Alan Freeman has put in the chat details of the IMG, and I hope you will take a look at our website if you haven't already, and consider reading and signing the manifesto, consider volunteering with us, and consider donating to us. So having said that, I'd just like to go to the speakers. Not all of them are still here, but I know Jinxiang is here, and just let me double check here. Mazda is here, I think, and Mohammad Marandi is here. So if anybody would like to respond, please go ahead. Perhaps
would you like me to comment?
Yes, please go ahead, Professor Marandi.
Very briefly, what I would like to point out when it comes to protests is that, and sort of I'll link this to the question about funding Biden's re-election bid. Iran is sanctioned, so even if it wanted to fund Biden, it couldn't do that. Second of all, the United States has very strict laws, like in other Western countries, about foreign funding. And as you know, or as many of you may know, a couple of years back, the United States indicted 2 Iranians for sending emails to Americans, apparently in Alaska. At least that's the allegation, and trying to influence the US election. So if people from abroad send emails, then they can be taken to jail if the Americans can get their hands on them. And we also all know about the whole Russiagate hoax, which now is becoming increasingly clear that it was all fabricated. But the point is that the United States and other Western countries will not allow foreign countries to be involved in their election, whereas what the United States does to other countries, for example, in the case of Iran, Venezuela, is that they impose maximum pressure sanctions to make life as miserable as possible for ordinary people. And then it carries out media warfare and psychological warfare. So, for example, in the case of Iran, we have more anti-Iranian Persian media based in the West that's broadcast news than we have news channels in Iran. We have Iran International, which is based in the United States and London. We have VOA, we have Deutsche Welle, we have the BBC Persian. So they constantly spread misinformation, they spread hate, they advocate violence in Iran, they advocate violence. I've tweeted these, if anyone follows my Twitter account, and during the riots in Iran, which we had a few months ago, they were explicitly saying that you should kill police officers. So I have clips of them that any people can look at. If this was directed at a Western audience, these TV stations would be shut down immediately, and they would be taken to court, if not imprisoned. But in the case of Iran, it is not only allowed, but it happens repeatedly. So on the one hand, and the same is true in Venezuela. I visited Venezuela just a couple of months ago, fantastic country, and they were facing a similar situation. On the one hand, the American government was strangling the economy, and of course, propagating how socialism, the Venezuelan model, doesn't work. Well, when you put your foot or your boot on someone's neck, it is difficult to breathe, without a doubt. But in the United States, they say, during the Black Lives Matter protests, they kept repeating, "I can't breathe," but collectively, these very same NGOs were silent about the fact that the US government was strangling nations, not individuals, nations, one after another. And then, of course, you have the issue of Western NGOs and Western funding for terrorist organizations. In Iraq, the United States has roughly 2,000 NGOs, the United States and Europeans. And then they mobilize these NGOs to overthrow governments. Or in the case of Iran, they have a host of terror organizations, such as the MEK, which is thousands of people in a base in Albania. These people, during Saddam's war against Iran, they fought for Saddam Hussein against their own country. And they killed 17,000 people just in terrorist attacks, let alone during the fighting alongside Iraqi or Saddam Hussein soldiers. So what I'm trying to say is that the United States tries to manipulate both information, it tries to strangle nations, and then it tries to provoke populations. That is not it. So in non-Western countries, whenever there is a protest, there's always a fear of Western infiltration. So even if a country wants to allow, and I'm not speaking about China, I can't comment about China, but even if, let's say, Iran or Venezuela wants to allow protests, and we have protests regularly on my campus at the University of Tehran, anti-government protests regularly. During the height of the protests and riots, there would be like up to 300 students. Of course, we have 50,000 students, but we would have them. But the fear always is how the Americans and the Europeans infiltrate these, how they try to use these to create tension and unrest and violence and instability, because that is the US objective. So as long as the United States and Europeans behave in an exceptional manner, as long as they try to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, they are actually impeding countries from being able to continue their existence in a normal manner.
Thank you, Mr. Marandi. And Jinxiang, if you would like to you have the last word, I think.
Thanks. I want to say something about China and Latin America, South America. I want to say that China is a big power, but it is not strong enough. China is also learning how to become a global power. So especially in Latin America, we know perspective. Also, we or political relations with Latin America, but we have to learn how to coexist with the US, with right now the global power US in this region. I think right now China did not think very clearly about what China should do, but I think China right now China began to think how to become a
I guess we have lost Xinjiang, Jinxiang. Unless he comes back very soon, I think we should probably bring this to a close. Jinxiang, would you like to repeat what you just said over the last minute, because we lost you for a little bit?
Okay, I think not only in Latin America or in some other regions such as Africa or the Middle East, that China also learn how to be a global power. China has to face right now the global leader US. So China has to learn how to coexist with the global leaders such as US or the EU, and try to work with US or EU and to make the world more peaceful than ever. Thanks.
So thank you very much. I just
Radhika, can I just say, I put up a link to this afternoon's, well, it's 10:30 here in the morning, a link to the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. This Rick Sterling, you will love him if you haven't become familiar with him yet.
Thank you very much, Norma. And so, yes, I'd just like to bring this meeting to a close. I would like to thank, first of all the speakers. I know some of them have been here despite having a lot of other competing commitments. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to once again remind you to please check out the International Manifesto Group website at www.internationalmanifesto.org and consider reading the manifesto, signing it, volunteering with us to do our webinars and so on, and perhaps donating as well. Small or large donations are very welcome. I'd just like to also say that we are we try to have a couple of webinars, at least one a month. And we have in the works an excellent webinar on what's going on in Eastern Europe in the context of the current war in Ukraine. So please watch out for that. We also have one planned on imperialism in general and how to understand the phenomena today. Even though we are talking about its decline, its relevance cannot be denied. So we are going to talk about that and many, many other things. So please keep up with us and see you next time. Thank you very much.
See you.
See you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful being here. My first time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you and bye-bye.